It was a typical day in the courtroom, but little did anyone know that the events about to unfold would challenge the very essence of justice and perception. The judge, a man known for his unwavering authority, sat at his podium, his stern face reflecting years of legal battles, decisions, and unshakable resolve. But what happens when a powerful figure, like this judge, encounters an unexpected truth? Today, the case before him seemed straightforward. A black woman, standing accused of a minor offense, was about to be fined. Yet there was something different about her, something that struck the judge as intriguing but not worthy of much attention. She was a mother, a sister, a daughter. Yet to him, she was just another person in the crowded court, subject to the same rules and penalties. Her life, her struggles, her triumphs, were all unknown to him. Her name was Clarissa Williams, a woman whose resilience and spirit had carried her through the toughest times. Born into poverty, she had fought every day for survival and for the future of her children. Despite facing insurmountable odds, she had built a life for herself, a life where she could hold her head high. But today, all of that seemed to fade as she stood before this powerful figure, awaiting his judgment. Clarissa had never imagined this moment. She wasn't the kind of person to easily fall into trouble, but circumstances, as they often do, had led her to this courtroom. She could feel the weight of the judge's gaze, his eyes cold, perhaps indifferent, as he scanned the documents in front of him. This wasn't the first time she had faced such cold, dismissive eyes in her life, but each time, her resolve grew stronger. As the judge announced the fine she was to pay, Clarissa's heart sank. The fine wasn't just a financial burden. It symbolized something deeper, a reminder of the system's indifference, the barriers that society often places on those who already have so much to bear. But she had come too far to let this break her now. As the courtroom filled with murmurs, the judge leaned forward, his mind focused on what was next. Clarissa, standing there with her head held high despite the disappointment she felt, had no idea that her life was about to intertwine with the judge's in ways that neither of them could ever imagine. In the days leading up to this moment, the judge had seen countless cases like this. For him, it was just another day in court, another decision to be made. But for Clarissa, this moment was pivotal. Little did the judge know, her story, one of sacrifice, perseverance, and unrelenting hope, was about to make him question everything he had believed about justice, fairness, and the power of human connection. The stakes were high, not just for Clarissa, but for the judge too. His decision today would either reinforce the societal power imbalance or serve as a moment of reckoning. But no one in that courtroom, not even the judge, could have anticipated what would come next. This case, on the surface so simple, would soon reveal a truth that would shake the judge to his very core. And as the gavel came down, signaling the end of the hearing, the judge's face turned pale, a reaction that would speak volumes to anyone who had witnessed the events unfold. The courtroom was quiet, save for the soft rustling of papers and the occasional shuffle of feet. The judge, sitting at his elevated podium, cast a long shadow over the room. His eyes, stern and unwavering, scanned the documents in front of him with a detached air, as though he had seen it all before. A seasoned figure in the world of law, his face was one of authority, his posture one of control, exuding confidence in his ability to pass judgment. But in that moment, it was more than just a legal decision. It was a representation of something deeper, a system that often failed to see the full picture. Clarissa Williams stood before him, her body tense but resolute. She had been here before, not in this courtroom specifically, but in similar spaces where she had been judged not just by her actions, but by her appearance, her race, her very existence. The judge's gaze felt like a weight upon her shoulders, heavy and dismissive. He wasn't interested in her backstory, her struggles, or the sacrifices she had made just to make it this far. To him, she was simply another defendant, caught in the web of a system that valued efficiency over understanding, harshness over empathy. She had walked into the courtroom that morning with the same determination she had carried her entire life. She was no stranger to hardship. Raised in a neighborhood where opportunity was scarce and every day felt like a fight for survival, Clarissa had learned early on how to navigate a world that often felt stacked against her. She had worked multiple jobs to support her 2 children, sacrificed sleep, social life, and even her own health just to ensure they had the tools to build a better future. But now, as she stood in front of the judge, none of that seemed to matter. The fine she was being charged with, a minor infraction that had come from a misunderstanding in a city regulation, was trivial in the grand scheme of things. Yet, for Clarissa, it felt like a punch to the gut. It was another instance of the system working against her. It was a fine she couldn't afford, not just financially, but emotionally. The judge, without a hint of empathy, read the charges. His voice was cold, dispassionate. The defendant is to pay a fine of $200 for violating City Ordinance 1027. Payment is due within 30 days. Failure to comply will result in further action. His words hung in the air, cutting through Clarissa like a blade. She had expected this, but the sting was still sharp. Clarissa's mind raced as she stood there, her hands gripping the sides of her dress. It was hard to focus on anything beyond the burning resentment that simmered inside her. She had been in trouble before, but this was different. This wasn't a matter of a mistake or an honest error. This was a reflection of the system's disregard for people like her, people who had to fight every day to be seen, to be heard, to be treated fairly. She knew it was a small infraction, but to her it felt like the weight of the world was pressing down on her. Her gaze drifted to the judge. He wasn't looking at her with understanding or compassion. His eyes were filled with judgment, unclouded by the years of hardship she had lived through. She could feel the layers of bias that had already been placed upon her, layers she had learned to navigate since childhood. To him, she was just another black woman in a courtroom, caught in a system that often seemed indifferent to the struggles of those from her background. As the judge's gavel slammed down, Clarissa's heart sank. It wasn't just the fine. It was everything it represented. It was the reminder that no matter how hard she worked, how far she came, there would always be something or someone there to hold her back, to label her, to make her feel inferior. It wasn't just a fine. It was a reflection of an entire system that was designed to punish rather than uplift. As Clarissa stood there, her emotions a whirlwind of anger, frustration, and helplessness, she realized something profound. This fine wasn't just about the money. It wasn't just about the mistake that had led to this moment. It was about the unspoken power dynamics at play. The judge, with his position of authority, had just made a decision that reinforced a narrative of inequality. He had no idea the gravity of his decision, nor the deep scars that it would leave on someone like Clarissa. Her life had never been easy, but she had learned to persevere. She had made it this far, surviving the pressures of a society that seemed to place every obstacle in her path. But this was different. This fine was a reminder of all the doors that had been closed to her because of the color of her skin. It was a reminder of how her worth had always been measured by others' perceptions, not her capabilities. As she stood there in the courtroom, her hands trembling slightly, she thought about all the times she had been dismissed by employers, by strangers on the street, and even by the system that was supposed to serve everyone equally. But Clarissa was not one to back down. She had fought too hard, too long, to let this moment define her. It would not break her. But as the judge made his final pronouncement, he couldn't have known what was about to unfold. He couldn't have known that the truth about Clarissa's life, a truth he had no way of understanding, was about to be revealed, a truth that would not only challenge his judgment, but also change the course of his life. This was no ordinary fine, and Clarissa was no ordinary defendant. The deeper layers of the story had yet to come to light, and as they did, the judge would have no choice but to confront a reality that would make his face turn pale in disbelief. The courtroom was quieter now. The judge, Judge Henry Cartwright, sat behind his desk, sorting through a stack of paperwork, trying to wrap up the day's cases. The decision on Clarissa Williams had been made, the gavel had fallen, and as far as he was concerned, it was a simple matter. The law was the law, and people were expected to follow it, no exceptions. But something gnawed at him, something about the way Clarissa had stood there in front of him, her eyes unwavering, despite the weight of the injustice. There was something he couldn't quite place, something that didn't add up. As he shuffled through the pile of documents, one caught his eye, a small, inconspicuous folder, almost as if it had been deliberately overlooked. The name on the folder was familiar, Clarissa Williams. But what was this? He had already made his judgment on her case. This wasn't supposed to be here. Curiosity piqued. Judge Cartwright opened the folder, flipping through the pages. What he found inside was nothing like what he expected. There, buried beneath a stack of mundane legal paperwork, was a document detailing Clarissa's life, an in-depth look at her history, her work, and her contributions to society. His brow furrowed as he read on. Clarissa Williams was no ordinary woman. She had faced systemic oppression her entire life, but she had also risen above it in ways that would astonish anyone who truly knew her story. The woman who stood before him in court, seemingly just another defendant caught in the machinery of bureaucracy, had lived a life of sacrifice and service. A life filled with more heartache and triumph than most people could ever imagine. She had been raised in a poor, crime-ridden neighborhood, one where dreams were often crushed before they could even take root. Her mother, a single parent, had worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, and Clarissa, as the eldest of 3 children, had stepped in to help take care of her siblings. She had learned early on that the world would not give her anything for free. Everything she had to fight for. But it wasn't just her upbringing that set her apart. As Clarissa got older, she became determined to make a difference in the world. While many of her peers had turned to the streets for solace or escape, she chose a different path. She focused on education, on building a life that would not only lift her own family, but also serve as an example for others in her community. She earned a scholarship to college, and after graduation, became a community organizer, working tirelessly to address racial inequality and fight for better opportunities for people of color. She had worked alongside local leaders to create initiatives for youth mentorship, affordable housing, and job training programs. The more Judge Cartwright read, the more his chest tightened. Here was a woman who had spent her entire life not only surviving, but thriving, fighting for others in ways he had never truly understood. And yet, here she was in front of him, judged not for her actions, but for the color of her skin, her station in life, and the preconceived notions that society often attached to people like her. But that wasn't even the most surprising part. As Cartwright continued to read, a deeper layer of Clarissa's story began to unfold. Several years earlier, she had been instrumental in organizing a protest that had led to the passing of a critical piece of legislation that protected the rights of low-income families, particularly black families, in the city. The protest had gained national attention and sparked a movement that spread to other cities, challenging the very systems that Cartwright himself was a part of. Clarissa Williams was not just a survivor. She was a force for change. The discovery hit Cartwright like a ton of bricks. How had he missed all of this? How had he, in his position of power, passed judgment on a woman who was in many ways a hero? He felt a deep pang of guilt twist in his stomach. The fine he had imposed on her was not just a financial penalty. It was a slap in the face of everything she had worked for. It was a harsh reminder that no matter how much good she did, no matter how many people's lives she had changed for the better, the world would still see her as nothing more than a black woman in a courtroom, someone who could be easily dismissed, marginalized, and punished for the smallest infraction. The realization shook him. He had been so quick to pass judgment, so quick to make assumptions based on the color of her skin, her socioeconomic status, and the biases that had been ingrained in him over the years. He had seen her as just another person, another defendant in his courtroom, without ever considering the broader context of her life. As Cartwright sat there, His hands trembling slightly as he put the file down, he began to question everything he had believed about justice, fairness, and equality. How many others had he overlooked, dismissed, or wronged in the same way? How many lives had he impacted without truly understanding the people behind the cases? Clarissa's story wasn't just about her. It was about a larger truth that Cartwright had failed to see. It was about the systemic issues that plagued not just the legal system, but society as a whole. It was about the invisible barriers that had been put in place to keep people like Clarissa from ever truly succeeding, from ever being seen as equals. And it was about the deep-rooted prejudices that, even for someone like him, a judge who prided himself on his ability to make impartial decisions, could not help but influence his actions. As he grappled with the weight of what he had just learned, Cartwright couldn't help but feel the full force of the emotional turmoil that had begun to rise within him. His initial sense of authority, of control, had vanished, replaced by a profound sense of shame and regret. He realized that he had failed to do what was right, and that failure had cost someone who deserved better. But it wasn't just about guilt. It was about what he would do next. What could he do now that he understood the full scope of Clarissa's life, the full impact of her sacrifices? Could he undo the damage he had caused with a mere fine? Could he change the course of her life? Or would his actions forever serve as a reminder of the systemic failures that had shaped both of their lives? The tension in the room was palpable. Judge Cartwright, once certain of his decision, was now paralyzed by his newfound understanding of the woman he had wronged. Clarissa's story, her real story, was just beginning to unfold, and with it, so too was his journey of reckoning. He had been forced to confront the truth about himself, about his judgments, and about the world he had long been a part of. And as the weight of this realization settled in, Cartwright knew that this was no longer just about a fine. This was about justice in its truest form, and whether he could find the courage to correct his mistake before it was too late. Judge Henry Cartwright's hands trembled as he sat in his chambers, the discovery about Clarissa Williams still fresh in his mind. The decision he had made earlier that day, imposing a fine on a woman who had dedicated her life to fighting systemic injustice, seemed more unjust with every passing moment. The weight of the knowledge he had uncovered about Clarissa was too heavy for him to simply brush aside. He could no longer ignore the truth, and for the first time, the immense privilege that had shielded him from the struggles of others felt suffocating. He stared out the window of his office, the daylight fading, but his mind raced, consumed by a torrent of thoughts. He had been blind, so certain of his own righteousness, so convinced that the law was infallible. But the law, as it stood, had never been colorblind. It had never been equitable. He had been a participant in a system that had failed to recognize the full humanity of people like Clarissa. Now, with a sense of urgency he had never experienced before, he knew what he had to do. The next morning, Judge Cartwright made his way to the courthouse earlier than usual. He had already decided what he needed to do. The courtroom buzzed with the usual pre-trial chatter, but for Cartwright, everything felt different. His stride was heavy, weighed down by the responsibility he now carried. He had no idea what the consequences of his actions would be, but he knew that they would be significant, one way or another. He walked to the bench, sitting down with a deep, resolute breath. The case docket was in front of him, and though it was filled with names of countless individuals, there was only one name he could focus on now: Clarissa Williams. When the clerk called her name, Cartwright's heart skipped a beat. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned toward the woman who had unknowingly become the center of a storm that had been brewing for years. Clarissa walked into the courtroom, her gaze unwavering, her presence commanding respect. She had always carried herself with dignity, no matter the circumstances, and today was no different. But Cartwright could see something in her eyes, a quiet strength, a resilience that spoke volumes. "Ms. Williams," he began, his voice firm but tinged with a newfound humility, "I must apologize. I made an error in judgment when I imposed that fine. I had no understanding of the full context of your life or your contributions to society. I failed to see you for who you truly are. I am here today to rectify that mistake." The room was still, and for a moment, it seemed as though time itself had frozen. Clarissa stood still, her face unreadable. Judge Cartwright continued, his voice growing more emotional with each word. "You have done more for this community, for this city, for the people who have been overlooked and dismissed than I ever could in my position. You are not just a defendant in my court. You are a symbol of perseverance, of hope, and of justice in ways I could not have fathomed. I can only hope that, by reversing my decision, I can begin to atone for my failure." A hushed murmur spread through the courtroom as the weight of his words settled over the room. The audience, including those who had been skeptical of his impartiality, watched with a mixture of surprise and admiration. Judge Cartwright reached for the paperwork before him, his hands steady now, and with a swift motion, he tore up the fine. Clarissa stood silently, her eyes locked with his, searching for any sign of sincerity. The tension in the air was palpable. This wasn't just about a fine being reversed. It was about something much deeper. It was about acknowledging a truth that had been ignored for far too long. Slowly, Clarissa spoke, her voice steady but layered with emotion. "Thank you," she said, her words simple but powerful. "But this isn't about the fine. It's about the systems that allow this to happen. It's about the things that keep people like me in the shadows, unseen and unheard. You may have reversed the fine, but that doesn't undo the damage that has been done, not just to me, but to countless others who have faced the same prejudice. The work to make things right doesn't end here." Judge Cartwright nodded, his face softening. He knew she was right. The fine had been a symbol of a much larger issue, one that couldn't be corrected by one apology, one gesture, or one decision. But for the first time, Cartwright understood that the process of change, real change, started with acknowledgement, with a willingness to listen, and with a commitment to act in ways that dismantled the very systems that had perpetuated injustice for so long. Clarissa's words resonated deeply, and he felt a stirring within him, a desire to do more than just fix one wrong. He had been given a platform, a position of influence, and it was time to use it for something greater than himself. It was time to challenge the status quo, to confront the biases that had shaped his decisions for years, and to advocate for systemic change. In the following days, Judge Cartwright began to speak out publicly, using his position to shine a light on the inequities within the legal system. He advocated for reforms that would address racial disparities in sentencing and promote fairness and equality in the courtroom. His actions inspired others, both within the legal community and beyond, to begin examining their own biases and the ways in which they, too, had contributed to systems of oppression. Clarissa, for her part, remained resolute. She didn't seek forgiveness, nor did she expect it. She had long ago come to terms with the fact that the world wasn't fair. What mattered to her now was that someone in a position of power had finally seen her not just as a woman of color facing the system, but as a person with agency, with purpose, with worth. She had never needed the judge's approval, but the fact that he had seen her for who she truly was, and not just for the label society had placed on her, was a victory in and of itself. The community's response to Cartwright's transformation was mixed. Some saw it as a genuine shift toward progress, while others remained skeptical, wondering if it was too little, too late. But there was no denying the impact his words and actions had on the conversation around race, justice, and the law. The ripple effect of his decision would be felt for years to come, sparking dialogue in courtrooms, classrooms, and communities across the country. For Clarissa, the journey didn't end with the judge's apology. It had never been about seeking redemption from anyone. Her fight for justice was far from over, but the judge's actions represented a small but important step in the right direction. The system was flawed, but people like her, people who refused to stay silent, had the power to change it. And she would continue to fight, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been left behind. Judge Cartwright, meanwhile, had learned a valuable lesson. His path to transformation had been difficult, but it had also been necessary. His role as a judge was not just about enforcing the law. It was about ensuring that the law served all people equally and justly. The change within him was not just an internal shift. It was a commitment to be an agent of change in the world around him. In the end, the judge's journey was one of growth, and so was Clarissa's. The courtroom, once a place of power and authority, had become the setting for something much larger than a legal case. It had become the crucible for change that was both personal and societal. Years passed since that fateful day in the courtroom, but the reverberations of the moment between Judge Cartwright and Clarissa Williams continued to echo through their lives and the broader community. The change that had taken place in that courtroom was not just a fleeting moment. It was the beginning of a transformation, one that would impact them both deeply and shape the course of their futures. Judge Cartwright had become a different man, a different judge. He no longer saw his role simply as a dispenser of justice, but as a servant to a system that needed reform. His shift in perspective had rippled out beyond that single courtroom, influencing his work and the way he interacted with the legal system as a whole. Gone was the detached, authoritative figure who had once acted as though the law was a separate entity from the people it affected. Now, Judge Cartwright was a voice for fairness and empathy, advocating for the reforms he had once resisted. He worked tirelessly to address the systemic biases that had plagued the justice system for generations. He was vocal about the need for diversity and inclusion in both the bench and the jury, the need for training to identify and address racial biases, and the need for more comprehensive data on sentencing disparities. His work in this area would eventually lead to the creation of a task force dedicated to judicial reform in his state. While his actions were met with some resistance, old habits died hard in the world of law. Judge Cartwright had become a trusted leader in the fight for equality within the justice system. The woman who had stood before him, Clarissa Williams, found herself in a position she never expected. Though she had always been an activist, always an advocate for the disenfranchised, her recognition had previously been limited to a small circle of people who understood her cause. After the events in the courtroom, however, Clarissa's name began to be spoken with respect by people who had once only seen her as a statistic, a marginalized figure. Her story, the struggles she had overcome, her tireless work to improve the lives of others, was no longer just a background detail. It became the focal point of her life's narrative. She used the newfound respect to continue her work, but with even greater purpose. Clarissa founded an organization dedicated to helping those affected by the very biases she had once fought against in that courtroom. Her nonprofit sought to provide legal aid, education, and opportunities for advancement to underserved communities. It was not only about helping people in the same way she had been helped, it was about empowering them to find their own voices, their own agency, in a system that had often silenced them. Her efforts were not in vain. Clarissa's organization flourished, gaining national attention and bringing much-needed resources to the communities it served. And while she never sought recognition for herself, her efforts were honored in multiple ways, through awards, through partnerships with influential figures, and through the simple, powerful gratitude of the people whose lives she touched. But perhaps the most significant shift was the change in how people perceive Clarissa. She had always been a woman of immense dignity, but now, that dignity was universally acknowledged. The respect she received wasn't just from her actions, but from the recognition of her inherent worth, something that had been overlooked by many before that fateful day in the courtroom. She was no longer the woman who had been fined by a judge. She was the woman who had changed a judge's heart, and in doing so, had changed the trajectory of an entire community's understanding of justice. The relationship between Judge Cartwright and Clarissa remained cordial, though they had not become close friends. They would sometimes meet at community events or public hearings, where their conversations would always center around the work they were doing. The dynamic between them had shifted, however. There was a mutual understanding between the two, an understanding that transcended the traditional lines of judge and defendant, power and subjugation. It was a recognition of their shared humanity, of the mutual respect that had grown between them. One particularly memorable encounter took place during a public forum on judicial reform. Both Clarissa and Judge Cartwright had been invited to speak, but it was the conversation that unfolded after their speeches that left the most lasting impression. The two of them sat together on stage, side by side, engaging in a candid discussion about the nature of justice, personal growth, and the importance of seeing people for who they truly are. Clarissa's words that day would become part of the wider conversation about racial equality. She spoke not with anger, but with the kind of wisdom that only comes from lived experience. "We have all been shaped by the systems we inhabit," she said, her voice carrying through the room. "But we are not bound by them. We can change. We must change. And it starts with seeing the humanity in one another." Judge Cartwright, nodding thoughtfully, shared his own reflections. "I once thought I understood what justice was. I thought I could judge from a place of neutrality. But neutrality is a lie when you're not seeing the full picture. I have learned, through Clarissa and through my own mistakes, that justice is not just about following the law. It's about ensuring that the law serves everyone equally. And if it doesn't, then we must change it." The applause that followed was thunderous, but it wasn't the kind of applause one might expect for a political leader or a celebrity. It was a quiet, affirming recognition of the real change that had taken place. For the first time, the applause wasn't for what they had accomplished in the world. It was for what they had accomplished within themselves. The long-term impact of that day in the courtroom wasn't limited to just Judge Cartwright and Clarissa. The community as a whole had been forever altered by the lessons they had learned. The people who had once supported the unjust systems began to question their own complicity. The individuals who had been on the margins found their voices, knowing that there were now people in power who were willing to listen and make changes. Clarissa's organization, and the work she continued to do, helped create ripple effects in other cities, inspiring more grassroots movements and calls for reform. Meanwhile, Judge Cartwright's efforts in judicial reform gained traction across the country, and his example inspired other judges and lawyers to reconsider their roles in perpetuating racial inequalities. The audience watching this transformation unfold would have been left with a powerful message. Change is possible. The lesson of the story is simple yet profound. Before passing judgment, we must first seek to understand the full story. It is not enough to rely on assumptions or stereotypes. We must look deeper, listen harder, and strive for empathy. In doing so, we can transform not only our individual perspectives, but also the systems that shape our society. The power of personal growth, of truly seeing and understanding one another, cannot be underestimated. And as long as there are people like Clarissa and Judge Cartwright willing to challenge the status quo, to admit their faults, and to work toward a more just world, there is hope for us all. As the years passed, their story remained a reminder of what could happen when we chose empathy over judgment, when we chose understanding over assumption. In a world that often seemed divided by race, power, and privilege, their encounter proved that the possibility for unity, for healing, was always within our reach.